Our guest for this episode is Fiammetta Rocco, Administrator for International Booker Prize since it was established in 2005. Fiammetta spoke about her childhood in Nairobi, her love for books, multilingualism, and the significance of the International Booker Prize to the world of literary fiction. Fiammetta Rocco was an editor for 25 years at the Economist, specialising in books and arts. Her journalism has won awards on both sides of Atlantic. Fiammetta has been the judge of numerous prizes for fiction and non-fiction. Of Franco-Italian origin, she grew up in Kenya and read Arabic at Oxford University. Her book, The Miraculous Fever Tree, about malaria and the discovery of quinine, was published in Britain and in America. She and her family live in London and Scotland. Good evening, Fiammetta. Such an honor, such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Oh, thank you. It's lovely to be here.
So, as a child growing up in Nairobi, you were born and brought up there in Kenya. You developed a deep love for books, I gather. So, could you share with us how this passion for reading began?
So I actually grew up about 75 miles from Nairobi on a farm in rural Kenya in the Rift Valley. I and my sisters and my cousins were all girls. My grandparents were Italian, as you can probably tell from the name. And they came from the south of Italy, huge believers in education. But there are no boys in our family, there are only girls. And that was very lucky for us because it meant that the education that Southern Italian family would normally have given to boys, they gave to us girls. And we had no television. We obviously had no tablet, iPad, anything like that. We barely had a telephone. We had electricity from a generator. We had the World Service and we had books. So reading became the sort of glorious mainstay of our lives, certainly of our education at home. That's where the passion began. My grandparents, my father, and all my sisters, we all read like Filio. When I was about 6, my father gave me for Christmas a hardback edition of Winnie the Pooh. And I remember that he wrote in green biro, he said, "To my little Fiammetta, this is your first big book." Because it was quite thick, that hardback edition of Winnie the Pooh. It had lots of pages. I'd never read anything as long as that before.
And the first serious literary fiction?
Well, we would have read a mixture of things. I should think probably because my grandparents were great believers in fiction, in novels, in the power of storytelling. And both of them were born in the 1890s, so they were brought up in rather an old-fashioned way. I would have thought probably the first big book, really big literary book I read was Jane Eyre.
How did you feel about it?
I thought then what I feel now. I didn't have the words for it then because a word like feminism, in the early 1960s to a little child on a farm in Kenya didn't really have any meaning. I probably had never heard that word before. But there I learned about a woman who could stand up for herself, who believed in education, who believed in giving to others, being a very positive presence in somebody else's life. Jane Eyre, of course, she's a great reader, so she was an incredible role model. I thought of her then as a feminist before I knew that the word feminist existed.
Oh, that's wonderful.
I reread it about every 10 years, and I feel that more strongly now, probably 60 years after I first read it, than I did then.
How do you think book reading, the serious book reading habit that you have, it shape your life?
Well, I think that there's a reason why human beings tell stories. There's a reason why we invented printing, why we invented books. And it's all connected. All those things go back to fundamental human need, which is to tell stories, but also to listen to stories, to create bonds, a bond of trust and empathy between human beings is, in a sense, to share experiences. And telling stories and listening to other people's stories is probably the earliest way of doing that. So I feel that books, writing, storytelling is all part of the same thing, which I have and which human beings have a very, very fundamental need of, which is to create a bond with each other. And we do it. For me, it happened with books.
But it's almost like you lived in that all through your life. You have been a literary editor for Economist, and you're also in, I think, from 2005 onwards, if I'm right, you are in an administrator at International Booker.
That's right. Everything I've done professionally came out of that, initial gift of Winnie the Pooh when I was 6 years old and being taught to read by my father. Very, very, very fundamentally important thing for me.
You read Arabic at Oxford, you came to UK, but I gather you started your career as an investigative journalist.
I was a business journalist and an investigative journalist. My daughter was born when I was 40, so I had this late baby, and I'd been a freelance business journalist, investigative reporter for a long time. And suddenly, when she was about 18 months old, she went to nursery school. And I suddenly realized that actually being a freelancer is quite a lonely existence. And I wanted a sandpit with some friends. I wanted a nursery school that would take a woman of 40. And somebody rang me up completely by coincidence and said, The Economist is looking for a deputy books editor. Do you know anybody who'd be interested? And I suddenly thought, me, I would be interested. That I made that pivot and left business journalism without a lot of regrets, I have to say, to embrace, the literary pages back of the Economist.
This was in 90s, early 90s or?
1998.
1998. Can you recollect any interesting, though it's not directly related to books and other things, any interesting experience from being an investigative journalist?
That's a very, very interesting question. And I think it's related to what I was talking about earlier about storytelling. There are many, many ways of writing stories and reading stories of people's lives. And one of the things that's a fundamental key to somebody's personality is how they handle their money, or indeed how they handle other people's money, whether they're honest, whether they're fair, whether they're crooked, whether they're tight-fisted, whether they're generous. You see an enormous amount about somebody's personality in the way that they handle money. So I was interested in investigative journalism about individuals' business dealings and financial dealings, I think more than anything because of the stories that it told me about the sort of people they were.
You know Italian, French, Arabic, and of course English. This interest in translated literature, does it come from being multilingual?
If you grow up in a family where you speak different languages, my grandfather was Italian, my grandmother was French, my mother is French. Of course, we learned English at school. Because we lived in Kenya, we spoke Swahili. Actually, what you speak at home is a funny mixture of languages. because you have certain words you'll say in one language, some words you'll say in another language. If you're talking about food, or you're talking about shopping, or you're talking about kitchen utensils, then all these things will have their particular name in different languages. So I think we spoke a sort of mongrel language, really, many, many, many different roots. So we were in the habit of different languages from when I was at a very, very young age. But I think the other thing is that, and it's connected also with being a journalist, why I became a journalist, asking people about their lives, asking people about how they grew up, what their experiences were, how they faced suffering or pain or hardship or joy or love. Those are universal questions that you can ask in any language. And speaking somebody else's language when you're asking them about their own lives is a way of taking a step towards them, and then they open up. So reading translated literature is the same as having a conversation with somebody in their own language. In India, of course, everybody speaks multiple languages. Most of you three. So this will be something that's very, very familiar to you.
You're also a writer. Interestingly, you wrote a non-fiction book. That too, The Miraculous Fever Tree, Malaria, and The Quest for a Cure That Changed the World is the long title for the book. What made you write it, Fiammetta?
So, growing up in Africa, you're always warned by your parents, don't go outside after dark. The mosquitoes are there, you'll get malaria. Don't forget to put on the anti-mosquito spray. Don't forget to put down bed net at night. So living with malaria was something that eternally there as a warning. And in the early 60s, the way you guarded against it was in taking quinine. When you're young, quinine syrup, which is absolutely disgusting taste, terrible taste. But, and then tablets, and it was something that you did every Sunday. So it was something that was very, very familiar to me. My family, various people in my family had had malaria. As I began to read up about it, I realized that actually it's something that had existed all over the world. The word itself, malaria, means bad air in Italian. And in Rome, there was a tremendous amount of malaria because it was a very marshy, wet city. And there was malaria all over Europe. It's probably emerged from Asia Minor, across North Africa, across Europe, went with Atlantic ship to South America, to North America. I mean, it's very, 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 very common. And trying to find some way to treat it was of significant historical importance. So that was the root of it. That's why I became very interested. I found nonfiction, for me as a writer, turned out to be my thing. I'm not a novelist.
When did you get involved with Booker, International Booker?
So I was a judge of the English Language Booker Prize exactly 20 years ago in 2004. As soon as I finished that, they told me that they were starting this new prize called the International Booker Prize, which was going to be given every 2 years for a body of work. So it was really for an established writer, whereas the English Language Booker Prize is for a single book and it's given every year. So they asked me if I would come and be the administrator of that, which I've done all along now, almost for 20 years. And it was a mixture of books written in English, or authors who wrote in English, and authors who wrote in another language and who were translated. Very, very, very difficult to make comparisons between authors who write in English and authors who are translated, for all sorts of multiple reasons. the prize tended to go, with one or two exceptions, to people who wrote in English. And so portion of the money that was available for translators was not being distributed. So in the end, after the English language prize changed the rules so that any book, any novel written in English anywhere in the world, published in Britain and in Ireland, would be eligible, it made sense for the international prize then to be any novel or short story collection written in a language other than English, translated into English, published in Britain and Ireland, should be eligible for the International Booker Prize. So the two prizes together offer readers in the Anglophone world a snapshot of the very, very best fiction that's being published at any one time. Crucial change that was made in 2016 at the same time was that prize money, which is £50,000, it's a lot of money, is divided equally between the author and the translator. They are given equal prominence. There is no other prize that does that.
In the way it was conceived in 2005, the International Booker Prize for translators, and the shape that is it in now, other than the change that you talked about regarding the prize money getting distributed in 2016, were there any other changes?
The major change was that it was a prize for a single book rather than for a body of work. It meant that it could go to a first-time author, for example, who had never published before. So it could go to a very young writer, just as it could go to a very old writer. We have had shortlisted novels that were debut novels. We've had shortlisted novels that were maybe the 12th or 14th novel that a writer has written. It's open to anybody of any age, at any stage of their career.
One of the conditions that you have is these books, they must have been published either in UK or in Ireland. Why that restriction?
Well, it was really to mirror the other prize, the original Booker Prize for Fiction, which was started in 1969, has always been for books published in Britain and Ireland. In the very, very practical sense, to be completely honest, it's to limit the number of books that are submitted for the judges to read, because the unique thing about the two Booker Prizes is that every judge reads every book. There is no triage or distribution or subdivision of books between judges. Every judge reads every book, and there's a limit of how many books you can read in 6 months. They usually read about 150 books. If it was open to translated books published anywhere in the world, it would simply be impractical.
See, the reason I asked you, of late, there is wonderful literature coming out in India too, from various languages. Some really wonderful books, but they can't even get an entry to Booker because most of them, they won't be published in UK. I think it will still take some more time.
You know, of course, that we had a very famous Hindi novel, Tomb of Sand, which won quite recently. And that was the first time that we'd had a Hindi novel submitted for the prize. My long-term hope is that this prize is going to celebrate and promote the publishing of literature from other languages, including the magnificent languages that exist in India, languages like Kannada, spoken by millions of people as a first language. We almost never read literature from Kannada. I am hoping that this prize will help in its own small way to promote and encourage publishing of literature translated from those languages, because we in Britain, we need to read them.
Telugu, Tamil, the other South Indian languages, Malayalam, there's a thriving literary edition.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
One more important aspect this year, if you see, even the last year, I guess, the majority of books that were long listed are from independent publishers, not from the so called five, not many. So, what are your views about independent publishing and its contribution to literature in translation?
I think that the development that we've seen in publishing and selling of translated fiction in Britain has been very, very, very interesting in the last few years. It's now fastest growing sector of publishing fiction is fiction in translation. There's a huge appetite for it. Very popular with young people. In 2022, about 2 million volumes of translated fiction was sold in Britain, half of it to people under 35. There are languages that were not so popular 25 years ago are now incredibly popular. Translation from Japanese, translation from Korean, for example. And I think this all points to a certain independence of spirit, of taste, of curiosity, of courage. And we see that mostly among independent publishers. There are many, many, many small independent presses, publishing houses have been set up in Britain in the last 10 years. And they are much braver in many ways and more curious and more interested than their brothers and sisters in much more corporate publishing houses.
How many of these long listed books that you could read?
I've read them all.
I didn't know that actually, because I thought judges are supposed to read.
So it's a very, very interesting long list, from multiple languages, multiple continents, many, many, many different countries, different kinds of books. Some are short stories, some are long novels, some are short novels. There is a sort of common, it's not a theme so much as common concern, and that is about brokenness, about broken territories, broken nations, broken families. You see that over and over and over again being thought about and written about by novelists and writers all over the world. I think that was probably the single most common denominator. And within this brokenness, there is a search for community, kindness, for connection. It's not all dark. There's a search for something that is fundamentally hopeful about the human spirit, which is, I think, what gives these books its true humanity.
Who have been reading translated literature for almost 5 decades or so. What are your thoughts on evaluating the quality of translation when you don't have access to the original?
We've all read books where people who do have access to the original translation, to the original language, say to you, "Oh, it's such a shame you didn't enjoy it. You should have read it in the original language. It was so wonderful." Or we've read books that have been made by their translations into different languages. Both things occur. What happens when you read a translated novel is that you're reading a new book. It's a newly written, newly created, newly brought to birth book. If you only want to exchange one word in one language for a word in another language, then we'd use artificial intelligence. We'd use ChatGPT. We wouldn't need human translators. What human translators bring to the whole project is that they are writers at heart, and they are bringing a literary sensibility which creates an entirely new book. So I may not be able to read Hindi, but when I read Daisy Rockwell's translation of Gitanjali Shri's Tomb of Sand, I am reading a book that is utterly, utterly captivating because it's so wonderfully written. And in English, it's been written like that by Daisy Rockwell. So I'm reading her novel as much as I'm reading Gitanjali's novel. In a sense, you don't need access to the original language to feel the writing come to life in English. Quality prose, it lives, it takes fire in your heart and in your imagination as a work of literature. That's what gives it its power.
Other than the questions that I asked you, you want to say anything?
I think one of the most, if not the most fundamental thing about reading literature translated from other languages is that more than any other art form, reading allows you, in fact, it goes further than allowing you. It invites you to walk in somebody else's shoes. It is, in all the art forms, the one that is most imbued with empathy. If you want to understand other people, if you want to have your mind changed, if you want a new experience which helps you see the world in a different way, then read a novel translated from another language. Walk in the shoes of that writer and that translator and experience how their imagination works. It's a very, very fundamental political act, and goodness knows we need more of it rather than less.
Very nicely put. Now, my final question is, when you talk of translated literature, the immediate, if I may use a marketing term, immediate brand recall is Booker, International Booker Prize. What do you attribute the popularity of International Booker Prize to? There are other prizes too which are given for translated literature.
Well, it's interesting. There are prizes for translation. This is not one of them. This is not a prize for translation. It's a prize for the finest work of literature that happens to have been written in another language and is translated into English. What our judges are doing is that they are, in a way, reading around the world, it's part of a quest. They're going in search of the finest literature from other countries and other languages. And they're bringing back these amazing discoveries to readers in English. So theirs is a journey of discovery. And I think that is what it offers readers as well. And it's one of the reasons why readers find it so interesting. It's a quest, it's a journey, it's an adventure, and there is treasure at the end of it.
Thank you for the conversation. Thank you for your time.